the caffeine. Now you're going to wash it down with some water, get it right into the bloodstream.
That's exactly right. All right, well, good evening, everybody. Let me get to the first slide. All right, there we are. So we will be continuing with evolution. And really what we're doing tonight is we're concluding the argument from Folly. So I'll be done dismantling evolution, and the next time we'll start with the argument from truth. And so, got some more good stuff for you guys tonight. So let's go to the Lord in prayer, and then we'll get to it. Lord God, we thank you so much that we're able to gather tonight and able to go over just more reasons why, presuppositionally, the general theory of evolution fails, and even how evidence shows it to be arbitrary and inconsistent. Well, really, the evolutionists are arbitrary and inconsistent. And so, Lord, just have me be able to present this material clearly, and may I do so in a way that honors you and glorifies you and equips your people to be able to take every thought captive to obedience to Christ, to destroy arguments, to provide a defense for the hope that is in us, Lord. That's what this is all about, obeying those commands. So be with us tonight, God, and again, may we make much of you, and may our hearts glory in you, and may all this knowledge lead to doxology, worship of you. It's in Jesus' name that we pray all of this. Amen. All right, so recapping where we were last time, so far we've covered all of this. I'm just giving a fast summary. We've covered the problems of spontaneous generation. It's impossible. We've covered uniformitarianism and just its assumptions, why it doesn't work. We talked about radiometric dating and explored the three assumptions of it that absolutely fail. We talked about irreducible complexity, synergistic organs, sex, cell division, morals, fossils constantly defying the general theory of evolution's predictions, dinosaur tissue, historic record of dinosaurs. In fact, I showed you a bunch of historic pictures that humans drew that could be nothing other than dinosaurs, right? And then what we ended with last time was we started talking about missing links and evolution's failure to provide real missing links. And so we're going to finish this evening. We'll continue with missing links, and then we'll move into other things like natural selection, mutation, and all that good stuff. And so let's just jump right into continuing with missing links. Okay, so moving away from birds, because last time I was talking about birds and reptiles, the supposed bird dinosaur. Okay, well, that's been laid to rest. Okay, so now certain evolutionists, moving away from the birds, they appeal to fish as certain transitional forms. And in 2004, you had the discovery of the fossil, the Tiktaalik rosea, and pretty much when this thing was discovered, the news media titled it The End of Creationism. This was supposed to be the one that destroyed our position because it was a fish with legs. So you know those little Darwin fish things, like we have our Jesus fish, but then to make fun of us, they got the Darwin fish that's got legs. Well, they found a four-legged fish. And they dated it at 383 million years old, which they said would place it before the first tetrapod. That's the first four-legged animals. They're like, oh, this fish had four legs before we had four-legged creatures in the evolutionary reckoning. So, end of creationism. But the hype was not to last, because within 6 years of that 2004 discovery, footprints were discovered in Poland that dated 10 million years earlier on their reckoning than the Tiktaalik, right? And those footprints were of a tetrapod. So they're like, there were four-legged creatures that were here 10 million years before that fish. Therefore, that fish could not be the transitional ancestor of those four-legged creatures. It just means there's a fish that's got legs that has no relation to land creatures that have legs. And so they had to strip this of its transitional fossil status. But listen, popular websites, pro-evolutionary websites, still list the Tiktaalik as a missing link. even though the scientific community quietly now dismisses it. It's what I mentioned to you guys before, that the media will hype it up big, but once the scientific community says, no, we were wrong, that gets a small little article on the back page somewhere and nobody ever hears about it. And then popular websites still have this listed, but it's not listed, okay? It just isn't. In fact, these popular websites, they present these long lists of transitional forms, but the vast majority of them have been dismissed. Okay, and most of the things on there can't even qualify as transitional forms, but the few that people have touted, all without exception, they've been removed. There's just too many problems with them. There's too many objections with them. So my point is, there's not a single indisputable missing link of any kind. Not one. Yes, Al.
So are you going to cover prehistoric man?
Yes, we will get there today. Yeah. We just have to hit the fish first. We did the dino birds, now we're doing the fish, and of course, within like 2 minutes we'll be on man. So you were anticipating where I was going. But there's one more of these sea creatures. There was the massively hyped 2009 discovery of Pugila darwini. And this one was celebrated as the proof that seals and sea lions and walruses all evolved from a land mammal, because we've got this land mammal fossil that has all these aspects from which we can see that these three water creatures now had to have come from this. But here's the interesting thing. This fossil skeleton is just almost to the detail identical to the skeleton of the living North American river otter. Meaning, this isn't some ancient creature. This is a creature that's alive right now, and seals and walruses and sea lions did not come from the North American river otter. Okay, so it's just, but that tells you something. People see what they want to see. When a scientist could dig up a skeleton that matches a living creature, but say, no, we found it too deep, so it can't be that creature, even though bone for bone it matches, that lets you know that, listen, we've got nothing to worry about when these guys say they have a missing link. They're not looking at things clearly. They're seeing what they want to see. Now, per Al's question, no discussion of the fossil record will suffice if we don't also address the transitional fossils that are allegedly our ancestors, the ancestors of humans. And think about it. Human evolution should be the closest thing to us, like fish dinosaur, bird dinosaurs, and four-legged fish are supposedly hundreds of millions of years ago. But humans, even in the evolutionary time way, is no more than a couple million years. So this is the closest to us in time, and with that in mind, we should find more fossil evidence. There should be more remains left behind because we don't have to go back as far. Okay, so they should have a plethora of human ancestor fossils, but they don't. Do you know that scientists have more dinosaur fossils than fossils of alleged human ancestors? But dinosaurs went out 65 million years ago. Our evolutionary ancestry is only a couple million years ago. Why don't we have more of those? Okay? In fact, the fossils they do possess of human ancestors are teeth. They don't even have any real full skeletons. It's mainly teeth, a couple pieces of a skull. And so, again, that's just important for us to know. So it would benefit us to consider some of the fossils that have been touted as evidence of human evolution. You can't forget the hype that surrounded the Paranthropus that was discovered in 1959 by Mary Leakey. Now, the reason why this one is worthy of our remembrance is because this was promoted as the missing link for over a decade. So discovered in 1959, from 1959 to 1969, this was proof. This was the smoking gun. This is the missing link. But then, 1969, they realized upon closer inspection, this is just an extinct ape. Now again, this was quietly dismissed. Not the public fanfare that announced it, but it is dismissed. Okay? Likewise, you had the Ramapithecus, which was once declared as proof of human evolution, only in the 1970s to be reassigned to, again, another extinct ape. And so my point with these examples is critical thinkers should be wary of any present-day claim of fossil proof, because in time they're going to be disregarded as well. They always are. Every single time there'll be the fanfare, just wait, count, like I remember a couple years ago, New York Times, there was this cave in South Africa that had all these missing links. It had all the fanfare, and then it's like 6 months later, it was just on the back page. Yeah, it's not what we thought it was. This happens all the time. Just give it time. They discard it eventually. Okay, and the reason why this always happens is because their identification of these things is not based on hard science. Instead, it's interpretations built on their evolutionary presuppositions. They're looking at a tooth. To come up with this picture of this ape that walks upright and is making wrenches and using bows and arrows just because you're holding a tooth, that requires a lot of imagination. That requires a lot of interpretation that's coming from their presuppositions. Now, some of the more popular contemporary contenders for missing links are the Australopithecines, such as the A. afarensis, the A. africanus, and the A. sediba. And you guys are going to be familiar with the A. africanus because that's Lucy. You've heard of Lucy before, like, oh, we got the missing link, it's Lucy. Lucy's just an ancient chimpanzee. And so pretty much scientists always go back and forth and arguing on this. Some evolutionists insist, like, no, this is the first in the chain, to get up to humans, from chimps to humans. And then others are like, no, there's very little difference between, these fossils and chimps that we see today. There's no evidence that humans are related to them. And so, for example, Charles Oxnard, a renowned evolutionary anatomist, he rejects all these ones, the Australopithecines. He rejects them all. He's like, none of these are an ancestor of humans based on anatomical comparisons between them and humans. And again, this is an evolutionary anatomist. He's renowned. He's saying, no, this can't be. So again, the people who want to point to Lucy, it's just wishful thinking on their part. Now, the big objection that's going to come from unbelievers are the Neanderthals. Okay, and of course, I'm not talking about, hairy, stinky people we see today that we insult them by calling them Neanderthals. But instead, we're talking about the real Neanderthals. And from the mid-1800s all the way to today, it's been popularly presented that the Neanderthal was an ancestor of humans. But that all started to change when you had the discovery of a hybrid 4-year-old child in 1998. What I mean is a 4-year-old child that is half Neanderthal and half modern human, the fossil was discovered. So it's like, well, hold on a second. How could this work? Because clearly Neanderthals were able to breed with modern humans, which would mean they'd have to be a type of human. Now, of course, at first, people in the scientific community rejected the possibility, but then similar discoveries were made. In 2006, we had more data. You know how you have the Human Genome Project? Well, in 2006, we started getting data from the Neanderthal Genome Project. Yes, it's a thing. And it proved, without a doubt, that Neanderthals and humans interbred regularly. Now, here's the point. On the evolutionary scheme, you cannot breed with your ancestors from an evolutionary standpoint. What I mean is if we evolved into a new species, it means by definition we couldn't interbreed with the species we came from. Yet Neanderthals and humans interbred regularly, and all humans have a certain percentage of Neanderthal DNA. We all do. The Human Genome Project demonstrated that clearly. So the point is, scientists are still debating this, but the growing consensus, meaning more and more, the majority are moving to the position that Neanderthals are just a type of human. Okay, they're just a type of human. Not everybody's come over to that yet, but it's becoming more and more accepted. In fact, mitochondrial DNA, the DNA from the mothers, an analysis of that from a Neanderthal skeleton demonstrated that the DNA sequence between humans and Neanderthals differed between 22 to 36 places. So you look at their DNA, you look at ours, modern humans, it differs between 22 to 36 places. Now you might say, what does that mean? Well, that's within the range of modern humans, because you could take one modern human from China and another one from Argentina, and they will differ with one another up to 24 different places on their DNA. So if a Neanderthal and a modern human differ between 22 and 36, they're in that range, since we see modern humans differing up to 24. So these are just humans. It was just a type of human with big freaking heads. Sorry for saying freaking. They probably looked weird, right? Why anybody would have interbred with them, I don't know. But it happened. But they were regular humans, a tribe of humans that, at some point went extinct. But they've interbred with enough of the rest of the human population where we all have their DNA. They're just humans. They're descended from Adam, like the rest of us. Yes, Al.
There's nothing in Scripture that speaks of Neanderthal.
No, because the word Neanderthal is a modern word. It's like an 1800s word. So they dug this thing out and they said, this clearly isn't a human. Look at its big old head, But it turns out it's just a human with a big old head, It's not an ape-like ancestor that walked up straight. So when you hear these guys talking about, well, Neanderthals aren't humans, but they had technology and they had burial rites and they were religious, and they pretty much say they do everything we could do, but they weren't humans. They're trying to say that because they were before us and we came from them. But no, we're interbred with them. They're humans.
But there is Scripture that talks about giants.
There are. Now, I don't think the Neanderthals are Nephilim because they're not a whole lot taller than us. And when I say us, I just mean modern humans don't look like Neanderthals. So it was a type of human tribe. Like, again, look at the variety of humans today. Okay, you could go to England and you have, let's say a bunch of British people who are just Anglos, Jutes, and Saxons, and then send the average British person to like Tonga and compare them to a Tongan. They're both humans, but they look very different. That Tongan's got a much bigger head, broader shoulders, thicker bones and all that type of stuff. So I think the Neanderthals are just, again, another version of humans that aren't around anymore today. But when the human population was small, there was some interbreeding that happened with that group of people that's no longer here today. Getting back to this, unbelieving evolutionists admit that when it comes to fossil evidence for humans, there really isn't any. Lord Zuckerman admitted in his book, Beyond the Ivory Tower, he says there are no definitive links between man and earlier species. He wrote that if man did evolve gradually from ape-like ancestors, he said this occurred without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of transformation. In other words, I believe this happened, but I believe it happened in a way that left no evidence, just like Stephen Jay Gould said. That is faith. When these guys say, no, there's science and there's faith, no, these guys have more faith than a lot of Christians because they keep insisting against the evidence of their theory. Now, another thing to bring up when it comes to human ancestor fossils is the intentional fraud. There has been a significant amount of fraud in the scientific community that should also discredit their theory. And so I'll give a few examples of this. One of the most famous was the Piltdown Man. It was hailed as proof in 1912. And when people looked at it, they're like, oh, this has got to be it. But you know what Piltdown Man was? It was a human skull. They took off the human jaw and fastened on an orangutan jaw, but then put human teeth on the orangutan jaw. And then people looked at it, they're like, okay, this is a clear hybrid between human and ape-like ancestor. But then it was clear this was a deliberate attempt to deceive. Another example was Nebraska Man, which served also as positive evidence for evolution, and it was brought up in the Scopes trial of 1925. Like, we got proof. Look at Nebraska Man. You Christians are out of your mind. But Nebraska Man was just a pig's tooth. It was based on an extinct pig's tooth. Of course, trial was already over then. Public opinion was already swayed by the lie. That's usually the way it goes. I think it was Winston Churchill said that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets a chance to get its pants on, as it's getting out of bed. And so that's exactly what happened with this. In 1972, you have an awful hoax. I mean, this one is just messed up. But again, this one was hailed as proof of evolution. In fact, even National Geographic created a documentary that screened in movie theaters over this one. And it was all about the Tassidae people who were discovered in the Philippines. So you had this group of people in the Philippines, and it was said, look, there are survivors of this evolutionary pre-human group of people, the Tassidae. And again, they made a documentary, National Geographic. They put it in the movie theaters. This was just a cultural minority in the Philippines. They were humans, but they were being portrayed as if they were less than humans, as if they were evolutionary ancestors. And again, the whole reason for this was uncovered in 1986 by a Swiss journalist. It turns out that, again, these are just a minority people in the Philippines, but there was a government agency, or the head of this particular government agency created this fraud and said, we found this people so that he could raise money to benefit them. Like, we got to benefit these cavemen. And so by getting attention on them, a lot of people donated money. He embezzled it and ran off with it. It was all a fraud to make one guy rich. It's crazy. And then there was another recent example, 2005. It was a scandal that forced a renowned biologist to resign. He had to go into retirement. It was Professor Rainer Petrosk von Zieten, and he intentionally fabricated data to show a link between humans and Neanderthals, like an evolutionary link, before we even knew that, no, they're just humans. You know, when people were still saying, well, we came from them, he fabricated data to make it look like that, and for 30 years it was repeated without question. Finally, in 2005, somebody discovered that he actually lied and falsified it all, so he was forced into retirement. But that didn't stop the 30 years, because I guarantee the stuff he put out there was being taught when I was in high school. It wasn't until I was done with college that the truth was exposed, and I can promise you in the high school biology books, they're not talking about this. They just quietly forget it and move on to the next one. So the point is, there's a lot of fraud. Now, the most notorious fraud is the 1874 embryo diagrams by Ernst Haeckel, and I'm sure you've seen them. In high school, they have all the embryos. They got these were drawings, and they were, you had fish, salamander, turtles, chickens, rabbits, and humans. And pretty much what the pictures showed is, in the womb, at a certain stage of development, we all look the same. A fish and human embryo is no different. A salamander and human embryo is no different, which is proof in the gestation of the pregnancy, you can see all the stages of evolution. That's what they're saying. And so it was hand drawings, but Ernst Haeckel said this was all based on him dissecting and looking at these fetuses, and he drew them exactly as they were. I remember this in my high school textbooks. Well, here's the thing. In 1997, a detailed study of these embryos, scientifically, because we can look at them, was conducted, and it was obvious that Haeckel fabricated his drawings. All of these embryos at every stage look radically different from each other. Any textbook written after 1998 has no excuse for these drawings to be in there, and they have no excuse bringing up that these embryos are support for the theory of evolution. But I'm going to tell you, we are now deep into the 21st century, and this is still in the books. I remember when my daughter was at Oak Hills High School taking biology in 9th grade, I was looking at her book for the evidences of evolution, and this was brought up as one of the evidences. I'm like, this one's old. This shouldn't be in here anymore. They're not removing this from the books, but everybody knows this one's a fraud. But I guess they're counting on the 14-year-olds not to know that this is a fraud, and shame on the teachers for not being upfront about that. Now, there's a lot more examples of fraud that could be mentioned, but these suffice. And so my point with it is, we are not wrong as Christians for being skeptical when they make these claims that they have these missing links, right? Every missing link they have identified, later they said, okay, that's not it. Or if not that, it's turned out to be fraud, which is even worse. I mean, the other one's a mistake. This one's just deliberately lying. So what that shows you is evolutionists are just as zealous to win converts to their religion as we are. And they might say it's not a religion. Yes, it is. I mean, it's a worldview, and you are trying to convince people to accept your worldview. These guys, some of them are so eager to present a missing link that to their would-be proselytes that they're quick to uncritically accept fraud and misidentification. You know, they just are. Now, there's this anti-creationist, which means he hates creationism. And he's a science writer. His name's Boyce Rensberger. But he makes a candid confession. And I'm going to read it to you. Okay, so keep in mind, he's not a friend to us. But when he wrote this, he was feeling in an honest mood. And here's what he wrote. He said, at this point, it is necessary to reveal a little inside information about how scientists work, something the textbooks usually don't tell you. The fact is that scientists are not really as objective and dispassionate in their work as they would like you to think. Most scientists first get their ideas about how the world works, not through rigorously logical processes, but through hunches and wild guesses. As individuals, they often come to believe something to be true long before they assemble the hard evidence that will convince somebody else that it is. Motivated by faith in his own ideas and a desire for acceptance by his peers, a scientist will labor for years knowing in his heart that his theory is correct, but devising experiment after experiment whose results he hopes will support his position. You get that? He believes it on faith, and he keeps doing these experiments in the hopes that one day one is going to prove right what he already believes before the evidence. That's faith. That is faith. Okay, and this is what I've been arguing from the beginning. Presuppositions and worldview drive what people deem as possible ahead of time, a priori. That's why these guys are so quick to accept fraud and misidentification. So our skepticism is justified. Now, fossils aside, okay, we're done with the fossils. I'm sure you've also, though, heard about the human and chimp DNA. What about human and chimp DNA? Because we're bombarded with the statistic that humans and chimps have 99% the same DNA. So even without the hard fossil evidence, would not this DNA evidence still require one to accept human evolution, right? Well, wouldn't it? Well, first let me state this. It was never figured at 99%. The original figure was 97%, but somebody misrepeated it as 99% and it caught on and everybody kept repeating that. So the original figure that was stated was 97%, and that 97% figure came from a very questionable, crude technique called DNA hybridization. And what this was is they took single strands from the DNA, not the whole DNA, single strands, and they intentionally took the ones that looked as similar to the human ones as they can. They did not use the ones that looked very different from ours. So if they're taking the most similar individual strands, because DNA is complex, they're taking just little parts that look a little more like ours and comparing them and then said 97%. Again, when they're intentionally leaving out the parts that obviously look different. So I'm telling you, it's not 97%. Okay, it just isn't. And we already know this, right? We know that the Y chromosome is only 70% similar between chimps and humans. So just do some math with me. The Y chromosome comes from the man. That's half of us, okay? The Y chromosome is 70%. So it's 30% different from the chimp Y chromosome. Yes?
You once said in a sermon that all men are only one of 3 Y chromosomes. There's only 3.
No, that's the women, one of 3 mitochondrial. Yeah, men, we're only from 1 Y chromosome. Yeah, for all men share the same Y chromosome, all women share one of 3 mitochondrial lines, which is explained through the flood. But you got to wait for me to get like 4 more weeks from now. Okay, so I'll get there. But here's my point here.
Well, what about chimps? Do they?
No, and you have to understand, like, the DNA similarity between us and chimps is no different than between us and dogs. When you actually get the real numbers, it has nothing to do with evolution. It has to deal with common design. You know, so the thing is, and we're not saying it's the same DNA, we're saying it's similar DNA. So Y chromosome, 70%. That means it's 30% different. Let's say the woman's line, the mitochondrial, was identical to a chimp. And you know it's not because your wives don't look like chimps. But let's say that the woman's was identical to the chimp. The fact that the man's is 30% different would mean best case scenario, if our wives all looked like chimps, we would still be 85% different from a chimp. Okay? And our wives don't look like chimps. And so my point is, the figures are a lot bigger than what people are letting on. Okay? But let's be generous to the evolutionists. Let's say, okay, we know it can't be higher than 85. We know it's a lot less than 85, actually. But let's grant you 95%. Let's say our DNA is 95% the same as a chimp. People don't understand how dissimilar that makes us. a human being possesses enough genetic information to fill 1,000 books of 500 pages each. So take your DNA, take that information, it would be 1,000 books that are 500 pages each. Okay? Now, that would mean the differences between us and chimps, if there was only a 5% difference, would be the equivalent to 40 books. 4,500-page books is how much difference there would be between us and the chimps if we shared 95% of their DNA. To assume that mutations generated 4,500-page books worth of information in just a few million years, okay, it's crazy. It's the equivalent of 12 million words that were generated and arranged in a meaningful sequence. And they want us to believe that happened in just like 2 million years of mutations. That's crazy. Mathematically, that's impossible, and that's for a 5% difference. A 5% difference means there are 150 million base pairs of DNA that are different between humans and chimps. 150 million. Again, evolutionary timelines cannot account in 1 million years or 2 million years for the generation of 150 million different baseline genes in the DNA. It just can't. Mathematically, doesn't work. So evolution is dead on arrival right there. But it should be noted in addition to that, that DNA comparisons in various studies, that what I was mentioning, their method of gathering it doesn't compare all the DNA, only the parts that are pre-selected due to their similarity. But when all the DNA is compared, a much lower figure emerges, and to be generous to them, creationists grant them 81%. But I just want you to think about that. If 95% has 150 million different pairs of DNA, imagine what that number becomes with 81%. If 95% means there's 40 books different of information, imagine how much it becomes with 81%. The point is, we are not related to these things, especially in the timeline that they're saying. I'm sorry, like 100 billion years isn't even enough time for that much addition of new information, if it was even possible for evolution to make new information. And I'm going to show how it's not in a few minutes. But again, there's just not enough time in the universe for this to happen. Okay? So the question is, again, we have to ask them, why do they insist on common ancestry? Why do they view such impossible numbers as evidence in favor of their theory? It comes down to presuppositions rather than facts. Truly, there is a much better explanation, as I was saying, for the similarity between human DNA, frog DNA, chimp DNA, dog DNA. It's that God made this world, and he made life to operate in this world under certain conditions, and he's going to use a common design. We're all made up of matter, okay? We're carbon-based and all that kind of stuff. We breathe in oxygen. Of course, in the design of it all, he's going to use a common design mechanism and method. That explains the similarities. The similarities don't show ancestry. That's just an assumption on their part. So, just something worth keeping in mind. Now, our internal critique of evolution, we're getting close to the end of it. We've seen irrecoverable problems in their theory. We've seen the mathematical impossibility of spontaneous generation. I mean, those were numbers we don't even have a word for when I shared them with you. We've seen the irreducible complexity of life. We've seen the failure of uniformitarian and deep time assumptions. We've now seen the true lack of fossil evidence. We've seen the significant DNA differences between humans and ape-like creatures. So when we put this all together, really, like, these failures render evolution as DOA, dead on arrival. But one more issue needs to be internally critiqued, and it's the mechanism by which they say evolution happened, or the vehicle. Darwin proposed that natural selection is the vehicle that caused us to go from an amoeba to all this complex life that we have now. Now, of course, evolutionists don't believe that anymore, so you have neo-Darwinists. They believe it's a combination of natural selection and beneficial mutations. Okay, so these are their vehicles. And I want to point out that these vehicles are just as problematic as everything else we've addressed. This is going to blow up in their face too. So let me start with natural selection, survival of the fittest, right? You've all heard of natural selection. Only the strong survive. They pass on their genes to the next group, and the strong interbreed, and eventually, in Darwin's mind, become something greater, okay? Well, let me tell you something. Natural selection was not an idea invented by Darwin. Instead, it was first proposed by the father of taxonomy, Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus was a creationist. And therefore, natural selection was originally a creationist idea. Linnaeus pretty much said, look, we live in a fallen world, and ever since the fall of Adam, there's a struggle for survival among all life. Death permeates all experience on earth everywhere. So he said this struggle is the means that God uses to keep nature in balance. Now, other creationists after Linnaeus reflected on this as well, and they said, you know what, certain life forms with traits suited to their environment are more likely to survive and pass on their traits through procreation. Okay, so this was the common creationist view. The long-age geologists like Charles Lyell and all that, they rejected this. They're like, that's Christian nonsense. But by the time Darwin was around, the idea finally started to circulate among the unbelieving academics in England as well. And so Darwin was directly influenced in particular by these articles written between 1835 and 1837 by Edward Blythe. Blythe was a zoologist in England, very smart guy, and he was a creationist. And he wrote all about natural selection. Darwin adopted natural selection from this creationist. Where Darwin was innovating is unlike the creationist. Darwin said, you know what? I think natural selection is more than just survival of the fittest. I think it's a creative force that could create new life forms, not just talk about the survival of the fittest, okay? The problem with that, though, is that natural selection is not a creative force. It's an eliminative force, okay? In other words, natural selection doesn't create the fit. It eliminates the unfit. Survival of the fittest doesn't create the fittest. It eliminates the unfit. So imagine there's a single species in one environment, but various members of the species possess different traits. If only one of those traits adapts to the environment well, then over time, the members that have the different traits are going to die off. Okay, they're eventually going to die off, leaving only those that have that one beneficial trait. At the end of the day, that's a loss of genetic information, isn't it? You had in the species all these different traits, but after a couple generations, only one of them's left. All those other ones are gone. That's not the creation of new information. That's the elimination of information. So, for example, wolves that have short hair will not survive in the Arctic climate. They won't. So over the course of time, short-haired wolves would die off. They would be removed from the wolf populations, and all that would be left would be the long-haired wolves. There's no more short hair in their genes. If they come into a hot weather zone, they're dead. They're not going to make it. But either way, that is an example of a loss of genetic information, not a gain. So how could natural selection be the vehicle of evolution? It can't. Evolution requires the generation of new genetic information to produce different organisms. Natural selection only deletes genetic information. Now, eventually, the light bulb went on, and evolutionists understood this, and so they said, okay, it's not natural selection, it's mutations. Mutations are how we'll get the new information, and you'll get, new advanced creatures through this. They would say natural selection still plays a role because it deletes the non-beneficial mutations, which then leaves the beneficial ones to cause macroevolution. That's pretty much their theory. So the question is, does the theory work? Well, to answer this, you need to understand what mutations are and how they function. So I'll define it real quick. A mutation is an accidental change to the nucleotide sequence. I know everybody knows what a nucleotide sequence is. It's the letters in the DNA. Just scientists can't just say the letters. They're going to say nucleotide because they want you confused. But anyhow, so the letter sequence in the DNA, the nucleotide, okay, a mutation is where one of those accidentally changes. Now, evolutionists believe these accidental changes create new genetic information, which would then allow for the macroevolution. So what they would say is the very first living cell, that first microbe, which they call the UCA, the Universal Common Ancestor, They say that it lacked, obviously, the information that's in us, right? It was just one cell, we're many cells. And so, long story short, is they'd say mutations over the ages added information in tiny increments, and natural selection then cemented the beneficial mutations in each population. Okay, and so they'd say if you have enough billions of years and you have enough mutations and you have it incrementally happening, then you could get from one little bacteria to all the life forms we see now. Now, that early microbe, that first living cell, had 500,000 nucleotides, okay, 500,000 letters in its DNA sequence. A human has 3 billion, okay? So, the general theory of evolution requires the generation of nearly 3 billion, okay, because 3 billion, 500,000 is like a dot next to 3 billion, right? So really, to get from that microbe to you, microbe to man, evolution had to create 3 billion new nucleotides. If the first living cell only had 500,000, but we have 3 billion, 3 billion more had to have been created to get there. You understand, right? That's the problem with this. So we have to ask then, can this theory hold up to scrutiny? Can mutations account for the generation of 3 billion new nucleotides that did not exist before? And the answer is no. Okay, and I'm going to prove it and all that in a minute. But I want us to first acknowledge, though, that mutations are real. They do reflect changes in the genetic information of the life form. But the question is, what kind of change are we talking about? Remember what I said a few weeks ago? There's two kinds of change. There's the change where we're talking about a loss of information, or we're talking about the creation of brand new information. Both are changes, but they're very different. So you have to ask, do mutations create new information, or like natural selection, do they represent a loss of information? That answer is what determines this, right? And so, let me just tell you, most mutations are harmful to the organism. There are some useful mutations that occur, and I'll give an example, but then I'll answer the question with this example. You have low phytate corn, which is edible by cows. Cows can't normally eat corn, but you have a particular strand of corn that has low phytate, which makes it to where now the cows can eat it and digest it. So, you got your corn-fed beef, or some of you are like, no, I only eat grass-fed. Well, look, my corn-fed one's cheaper and it still tastes good. But anyhow, so you have this phytate, okay, it's lower in this corn, and the reason that happened is because of a beneficial mutation. When they studied this at a molecular level, what they realized is, though, to get that mutation, something broke. Something broke in that corn to produce the new trait. And what I'm telling you is every mutation that has ever been looked at is the exact same case as this. It's always something that's broken. Okay, it's never something new that's made. So a useful mutation is when that broken material just happens to serve you in your environment. Sometimes something could break where you're like, oh, I'm glad this is broke because now, I could function better here. Like imagine if the part of your body that makes it to where you could feel pain broke and you can't feel any pain. You would be able to push yourself a lot further at work and all that stuff than everybody else because you wouldn't fatigue. Now you might work to death, but if you're smart, anyhow, you get my point. It would seem like you're the next level. You're X-Men, you're the guy who feels no pain. But it's not an addition of information. Something's been lost, but it was beneficial to you. Same thing with the corn. Not to get too technical, but with the low phytate corn, the mutation damaged the metabolic pathway that makes the phytate. In other words, it broke the part of the corn that makes all that phytate, and that's why it has lower phytate, and then the cows could eat it. But the point is, it's a loss of information. Okay? So if mutations are to generate new information, that's not it. And here's the thing, there's a perfect way to test this, and one guy did test it. Okay, the best way to test it's on microbes, little bacterias, because you could get a lot of generations in a short amount of time. They reproduce quickly, they have huge populations. So in 1988, Michigan State University professor Richard Lenski conducted an experiment. He founded 12 cultures of E. coli. We all try to avoid E. coli. We don't want to get sick. So he's playing around with 12 cultures of it, and he grew 44,000 generations. So that's how many generations of them, 44,000. over a period of 20 years. And what he did is he had these microbes consume more citrate than glucose. Normally they would have glucose. He switches it up, make it have citrate, and he was hoping that that change would have evolution occur in the lab. Well, he was disappointed in these 20 years because in those 44,000 generations, every possible mutation that could come up did come up. Some of them more than once. There were no possibilities beyond what actually happened in his lab. And so he's like, man, at the end of this, there's no new adaptive traits. Not even one. 44,000 generations. But later, there was a close inspection, and he reported actually that, no, one of the 12 cultures acquired the ability to use citrate in the presence of oxygen. It took 31,500 generations. Okay, but one of them could now use citrate when there's oxygen. And listen, these things usually can't absorb citrate and oxygen. They have to be in a place where there's no oxygen. But now one of these could, okay? So evolutionists then start saying, proof. This is proof that we have a new adaptive trait. It must be new information. But here's the problem with this. E. coli can already digest citrate under non-oxygen conditions or anaerobic conditions. The only thing you would need for it to be able to do the same in aerobic or oxygen conditions is you just have to break the component in it that stops the citrate consumption when oxygen is around. And when they looked closely in 2012, they found that the mutations that were responsible for this new ability was just that. It was broken. It broke the thing that would prevent that absorption. Once that thing was broke, now the absorption could happen. It wasn't new information. It was lost information again. 44,000 generations. And they got one change, and that one change was proven to be a loss of information. I don't know what else these guys can expect, right? I really don't. Every example, and sometimes people will bring up like, well, evolution is proven by the fact that bacteria is getting resistant to our antibiotics. You've heard that before, right? Like our sicknesses are now, they've evolved. No, they have not. Okay, so here's the thing. This one is like so dumb, right? Within these bacteria, you have a minority population. Okay, this is just natural selection. You have a minority of them that are already immune to the antibiotic. The majority of them are not immune. So at first the antibiotics work because they wipe out that majority. But that small little minority that was already immune doesn't get killed. The majority does get killed. All that's left is that minority. And then it starts reproducing. And so now you have, again, it was a loss of information in that whole community, not an addition of information. And so now you have a huge population of bacteria that was already resistant to it. It wasn't that they developed this. Okay, it wasn't that at all. And then, of course, for some of them, there would be a mutation. But again, when they inspect the mutations always break something. They break something that if it wasn't broken, the medicine would work and kill that thing. But it broke something to where it made it to where now the medicine's not being absorbed. That's all it is. It's a loss of information. Same thing when people say, well, mosquito populations are becoming resistant to DDT. It's the same thing. When they study those mosquitoes, it's broken it's mutations that break something in their DNA. Remember, we had 44,000 generations in that one dude's experiment. When you consider that in 44,000 generations, there was only one instant of a mutation causing change, and it was due to a loss of information, the notion that mutations could be a mechanism that would make 3 billion new nucleotides, it's out of the realm of possibility. 44,000 generations couldn't even make one. And yet these guys want us to believe that mutations can account for 3 billion new nucleotides to get from microbe to man. It just doesn't work. This is a theory that depends on faith. It is a blind faith theory. Okay? So if you can't find new genetic information in microbes, why would you expect to find it elsewhere? Now, the last thing that I'll bring up is the evolutionists say, but what about the stickleback fish? And I didn't want to give it its own slide. It has nothing to do with microbes. But the stickleback fish is just another example of both natural selection and a mutation deleting information. You might not know what the stickleback is. If you look it up, it's pretty interesting. But you have the saltwater version and you have a freshwater version. The saltwater version looks like it's awesome looking. It's got armor plates. It's longer. It's got these like spikes on its back. You're like, dang. And then you look at the freshwater ones. It's got no armor around its pelvis. It doesn't have spikes. And the few armor plates it has are tiny. It's like weak sauce. And evolutionists say, well, the freshwater one's descended from the saltwater one, and clearly this is evolution at work. And creationists look at it and say, we agree, the saltwater one is the original one, but this isn't evolution caused by an addition of information. They looked into it. They've identified the exact area where something is lost. So there's a mutation in a gene called PIT-X. And pretty much this corrupted gene prevents the spines from forming in the pelvic area, and it prevents the bony armor stuff forming. So it's a mutation in the freshwater version. Something got broke that doesn't make it produce what its saltwater cousin can produce. That's the special theory of evolution. We already agree with that. Creationist models would say that's exactly what would happen. You have a kind, and then of course, in a fallen world, you're going to have things that change, which are going to make kinds speciate, and it's always going to be due to a loss of information or something broken. So the stickleback, I just bring this up so that you would understand that it is a dishonest example of them pointing to the special theory of evolution and then saying, therefore, the general theory of evolution. Remember, the general theory requires new information. The special theory requires lost information. You can't point to an example of lost information and say, look, therefore, new information. It's a lie. It's dishonest. So anyhow, yeah, so when they hail the stickleback as an evolutionary gem, it's just a gem of dishonesty. All right, so a couple more things. Studying mutations in humans also does not help the evolutionist. Okay, you've heard of the Human Genome Project, which is, this was significant for the field of science, specifically genetics. And now they say that we have more data than theory when it comes to genetics. Well, with the Human Genome Project, we realized just how bad mutations are and how many there are. We're headed towards something called genetic entropy. If you don't know what that is, it means eventually we're going to have so many mutations we're going to go extinct. So the coming of Christ has to happen, sometime before then. But anyhow, the aggregation of mutations in the human genome, it's happening way more rapidly than natural selection could remove them. And in fact, the mutation rate was proven to be 50 times faster than what the evolutionists thought it would be. And so, let me just give you the numbers. Humans gain around 100 new mutations per person per generation. What that means is due to generational accumulation, the 60-year-old person, there's a couple of you, 60-year-old person has 40,000 mutations in each cell lining your intestinal tract. 40,000 mutations. And I'll be there in a decade and a half. So then I'll have the 40, who knows, it might be 45,000 mutations by then because it just keeps going up. The point is, if humanity is as old as the evolutionists claim, mutations at that rate, there would be too many where we'd all be extinct already. So we can't be a couple million years old. We can't. There's just way too many mutations already, and the rate is way too fast. Now, evolutionists who are aware of this problem, their answer is the stupidest answer you could possibly think of. They say, well, listen, I know it looks bad, but maybe when you take all these mutations and you put them together, it has a positive effect, whereas if they're all by themselves, it would have a negative effect. And if that sounds dumb to you, it's because it is dumb. If that sounds irrational to you, that is irrational. That's almost like saying, well, I know if we murdered 12 people individually, that would be 12 murders and that would be bad. But what if all 12 died at the same time? It causes life. No, it doesn't work that way. It really is just dumb. A process that increases genetic entropy cannot produce a better life form over time. We're just going to break down more and more. So look, when people are like, oh, we're getting sicker, there's more diseases, it must be what the pharmaceutical companies are giving us and those chemtrails in the sky. Look, without all of that stuff, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I think a lot of that stuff's just out there. I could be wrong, but whatever. If you didn't have any of that stuff, we would still be getting sick at the rates we are, worse than people were 100 years ago because of the rapid accumulation of mutations. Most mutations are harmful. The ones that are benign still represent a small loss of information that we need, and it adds up. The cumulative effect of it is we will keep getting sicker and sicker because of the accumulation of mutations. That's just the way it is. But anyhow, that had nothing to do with this lesson. For some reason, I just felt like throwing that out there. But anyhow, considering everything that's been said so far, I think you guys, I would hope, would agree with me that the general theory of evolution, it just doesn't have a chance. Their alleged vehicle is impossible. Okay? Natural selection and mutations delete information. They don't generate new information. So they got nothing. We also saw that spontaneous generation's mathematically impossible. We looked at the irreducible complexity, which gave us so many chicken and egg problems. It can't be solved by anything other than intelligent design. Okay, we went, I'm not going to just repeat everything we've already done. My point is, their view is not reasonable. It isn't. And it's not characteristic of a free-thinking person to believe a theory that is so riddled with insurmountable impossibilities. Okay, evolutionists believe in this anemic theory despite all the evidence against it. When they say, I believe in evolution because of the evidence, I'm telling you, that is just bravado. It's either bravado or it's ignorance. Okay? And we know why they believe it. Their materialistic presuppositions require a theory like this. Okay? And their assumptions blind them to everything that slays their theory. We've slayed it 10 times already. And they're not unaware of this stuff. This isn't in a magic creationist book. A lot of this stuff's published in their peer-reviewed journals. And they just find a way to say, well, yeah, but we'll come up with an explanation one day. And then they just move on like nothing ever happened. Okay, so I'm hoping that we've seen that it's the presuppositions that are driving them, that they're inconsistent, and that they're arbitrary, and that the argument of folly or from folly destroys the theory of evolution. Now, I know you want me to pray and be done, but I shall not, because with every worldview we slay, we also talk about the consequences. So what are the consequences of this? It's been huge. When you consider the consequences of the general theory of evolution, it is impossible to see this as anything other than a horrific idea that was unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. Okay? Even if we take out the millions of murdered babies through abortion, and keep in mind, abortions happen because of evolution. It's evolutionary theory that disregards this as life. But let's even take the millions of abortions out just for a second. In the 20th century alone, you had 130 million human beings murdered in the name of atheism and evolution. Now, I want you to understand, the total number of those killed in the name of Christ in 2,000 years of history is at most 17 million. And it might not be that high. And that's horrible when I say, oh, we only killed 17 million. No, that sucks. That's really bad. And that's the highest number, 2,000 years of history. You're taking into account the Crusades, witch trials, pogroms of Jews and stuff like that. All that which is horrible. But I bring this statistic up to say when somebody claims more people died in the name of religion than any other cause, it simply is not true. Atheistic evolution in less than 100 years killed 8 times more people than the maximum amount Christianity killed in 2,000 years. Okay, 8 times more in just 1 century. Okay, and furthermore, the people who killed in the name of Christ killed because they were acting contrary to Christian doctrine. They're acting the opposite of what the Bible tells us to do. Whereas every single person killed at the hands of atheism died at the hands of people who were consistently applying an evolutionary worldview. Jeffrey Dahmer, the famous serial killer who would murder gay people and then eat them, he said the reason why he did that is because he believed in evolution. He said it was just survival of the fittest. This is what happens in the state of nature. These people tasted good to me, and I was the hunter, and I outsmarted them. And so he said evolution is what convinced him this was okay, right? So, of course, most evolutionists are horrified by what he did, but my point is he's way more consistent with the theory than they are, Okay, every person killed at the hands of an atheist is being killed by a person who's acting consistently with what they believe. I'm thankful that most atheists don't act consistently with what they believe. Okay, but a Christian that murders somebody is acting inconsistent to our worldview. The atheist that murders somebody is actually operating consistently within their worldview. Now, evolutionists will push back against this, but not in a way they can philosophically defend. At the end of the day, their worldview, somebody killing somebody should be as indifferent as a lion killing a zebra. But somehow they try to say it's different with us. Well, how? We're just an evolved animal. So they can't get around that. Now, the facts do not bode well for the evolutionary ethicist. Only a few decades after the publication of Origin of the Species by Darwin, Australia's indigenous Aboriginal people were murdered. And do you know that their body parts were shipped to British museums and presented as missing links? These were human beings, chopped up, dismembered, and then their bones were in British museums. Hey, here's monkey men. Here's the missing links. Now, Darwin and other evolutionists promoted the idea that some races were more evolved and civilized and others were still closer to the ape-like ancestors. That belief energized the German atrocities against Africans in Namibia in the 1880s. In fact, these native Africans, they're called the Herero people, they were labeled as baboons. Human baboons, and they were enslaved by the Germans. Now, in 1904, they rebelled against their German overlords, and so the Germans sent an army of 14,000 people with a newly invented weapon called the machine gun, and they slaughtered them. That tribe went from 80,000 people down to 15,000 starving refugees in the name of evolution, because they were seen as unworthy baboons, not full humans. And of course, you can't talk about the horrors of genocide without discussing the Third Reich. Prior to Nazi ascendancy, it wasn't just the Nazis that came up with this. In the 1920s, Weimar Republic in Germany, social Darwinism was entirely enmeshed in their academic circles. And long before Hitler took over, this trickled down to the popular level. So when the Nazis initiated the final solution, it was justified by the theory survival of the fittest, which their society had long accepted. And so this drove the regime to murder the handicapped, to euthanize the elderly, to sterilize so-called inferior people, and to ultimately try to wipe out Europe's Jewish population. In fact, if you look into Hitler's race classifications, all of his racial classifications were based on how related he thought you were to chimps and apes. And so the Jews to him were literally monkeys just that looked like humans. And then blacks were the next lowest, and then it just kept going up. And so the point is, it was all based on evolution, every bit of it. Now, some people try to paint Hitler as a Christian. No, he did this as a Christian, but that's dishonest. Hitler repudiated Catholicism. He grew up as a Catholic, but he rejected it. He made it clear he rejected it. He instead, as a religion, became a neo-pagan, and he combined that neo-paganism, because he was going back after the Viking religions, right? He combined that with the theory of evolution, or Darwinism. And what drives me nuts is it's liberals who used to try to say Hitler was a Christian to make us look bad. And the record's clear, he wasn't. But now you got these racist Reformed Christians out there who are trying to say Hitler was a Christian and he was a true German prince, and the Jews have just smeared his reputation. And that is growing in certain congregations in this country. It's despicable. It's spreading like wildfire among the Christian nationalist movement. And though I have affinities with the idea that the more Christian a nation is, the better it will be, the people who are pushing this idea are some of the worst people in our country right now. They're now trying to claim Hitler as our own, which is just insane to me. But anyhow, it's another tangent that's not in my notes. But yeah, the evolution's what drove the Nazi quest to mass murder people they deemed inferior. And so once the idea of euthanasia, eugenics, and I can't remember how you say it in German, it's something Leben, something von Leben, but it means life unworthy of life. Once that idea was mainstream, where people thought, yeah, some life is unworthy of life, which is how people talk about fetuses, today in the womb. Well, anyway, once that was mainstream in society, they became capable of an evil that makes the Crusades look like nothing. Voltaire. I don't like Voltaire. Okay, he's an Enlightenment jerk. But he keenly said this. He said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And he's right. If somebody could get you to believe something like evolution, they could get you to do very evil things. The theory of evolution proves him correct. 6 million Jews and many other minorities were brutally killed in the name of evolutionary racial purity. Joseph Stalin, how many of you have heard of him? The most evil Russian, Soviet dictator. Well, do you know that he was actually as a boy wanting to be a priest? An Orthodox priest, but as a 13-year-old boy, he read The Origin of the Species and at that moment embraced atheism. And he said, once I became convinced of atheism, I knew life was cheap. It had no value to him. And that's why when he was in power, low estimates have him killing 13 million of his own people. High estimates between 25 to 30 million. Life was cheap to him. The communist Chinese dictator Mao Zedong ruled China from 1945 to 1976. In that time, it is estimated that he killed between 40 to 70 million people. He commented that his two favorite books were written by evolutionary pioneers Darwin and Huxley. Okay, that's where these guys are getting their ideas. In Cambodia, the communist dictator Pol Pot utilized his Khmer Rouge rebels to commit genocide against his own people. I believe he killed between 2 to 4 million people between 1975 and 1979. And his justification for it was the cheapness of human life. He's like, we're all evolved from monkeys. There's no God. Our lives don't mean anything. That's how he justified killing 2 to 4 million people. I was friends in high school with a survivor of the Cambodian purge. I remember he was a couple years older than me. He was the age of my older brother, but I remember once he lifted up his shirt and he had 3 bullet hole wounds and the exit wounds in the back. I'm like, dude, what the heck? And he said that the communist rebels shot him with an AK-47 when he was 5 years old and left him for dead. Somehow he survived. But that's what evolution, that's what atheism leads to. In 1999, 15 people died in a shooting spree at Columbine High School. We all remember that. The 2 teenage murderers were obsessed with natural selection, Nazism, and Darwinian evolution. That was what they just filled their minds with. And there have been a lot of school shootings since then, and the mass murderers almost always are zealous Darwinists. There's been a new trend. A lot of them are transgender now. But the point is, if you were to look at what they believe, they're probably also are Darwinists. But even before this new transgender trend, most mass shootings are done by Darwinists. I can't think of any that are done by committed Christians. So again, it follows this worldview. When you add to this the horrors of systematized racism, widespread acceptance of abortion and euthanasia, you scarcely will run out of the terrible examples of what the theory of evolution has brought on the world. R.C. Sproul wisely said that ideas have consequences, and he's right. Entire societies sowed the wind when they granted the exclusive and privileged status to evolution in the school system, and now we're reaping the whirlwind. Crime rates up, mental health stuff's up, school shootings. Most people don't even want to put their kids in school anymore because they're afraid their kids are going to get shot. That was not something my parents had to worry about. But me as a parent, that's something I have to worry about. And the school shootings even happen at Christian schools. So, I mean, it's insane. But this is what we get as a society for privileging this worldview, because it's being carried out to its logical conclusion. Evolution dehumanizes people and it robs them of dignity. It reduces them to animals trapped in a game of survival of the fittest. Now, as I said, it's good that most people will be inconsistent. Okay, they could deny the biblical God with their mouths, but most can't escape the imprint of his image on his hearts. But there's some people who dive so deep into it that their conscience gets seared, and they blind themselves to that image, and then they start acting like the animals that they think they are. And that's increasing, and that is why our society is becoming increasingly unstable. It's just insane. So, consequences of this. This theory is awful. So let me conclude, and then we'll be done with the argument from Folly. we really don't have anything to fear from the general theory of evolution. In a nutshell, it argues that there was once nothing but disorder, all compressed into a tiny dot, and then the universe somehow exploded from that dot, which then created an orderly realm of inorganic, or meaning non-life material. But then that inorganic material somehow came to life, bringing order from disorder. It began as efficient cell division, but then jumped to inefficient sexual reproduction, and then evolved into intelligent moral beings. Now, I say that in a way that makes it sound stupid because it does sound stupid, but what I just said is not a caricature. That is what they believe. That is the theory of evolution. So we have the right as Christians to say, okay, how in the world can random disorder become a uniform order, especially if you think fundamental reality is impersonal chance? We need to ask them how inorganic stuff began to live despite the mathematical impossibility. They can't give us a good answer. Their theory contradicts every observable pattern in all the fields of science. They believe in life from non-life, disorder to order, cell division becoming sex, all that stuff. None of that's ever been observed. When we look at the world, you don't have order turned to, or disorder turned to order. You have order turned to disorder. You don't have non-life become life. You have life come from life. And then eventually that's what's living becomes non-living, but you never have what's non-living become living. So everything we observe is the opposite of what they want us to believe. It just doesn't make any sense. It's riddled with inconsistency, arbitrariness, and the impossibility of meeting the preconditions of intelligibility. Not only that, we know they dishonestly confuse people by using examples of the special theory of evolution as evidence for general theory of evolution. And you can't do that. One does not prove the other. It just doesn't. At least Roger Lewin of Science magazine admitted. He said, when you offer microevolution as evidence for macroevolution, he's like, it's fallacious. He said, quote, the central question of the Chicago conference, which was an evolution conference, was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution could be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. At the risk of doing violence to the positions of some of the people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no. In other words, he said, you can't do it. You can't use micro or the special theory as proof for macro or the general theory. You just can't. He's like, it's wrong. It's dishonest. It doesn't work. Okay? So the general theory of evolution is nothing more than an ancient philosophy repackaged with scientific vocabulary to offer unbelievers a smart sounding way, excuse to reject God. The truth of the matter is their theory cannot account for the preconditions of intelligibility. The transcendental argument absolutely kills it, since the theory depends on the materialistic atomism that I brought up in the third lesson, Unbelieving Philosophies, the uniformity of nature, the immaterial laws of logic, the definite existence of moral absolutes. These all land a crushing blow to all the evolution's presuppositions. Additionally, it is inconsistent and arbitrary to use uniformitarian ideology on matters that point to an old earth, but then ignore those same uniformitarian assumptions on the test that demonstrate a young earth. And that's what they do all the time, as I pointed out with moon recession and the magnetic field and things like that. So riddled with fallacies, evolution fails the coherence theory of truth. Remember when I was telling you about the theory of truth? The coherence theory means it has to be logical. It can't contradict. There's all these fallacies. So it fails the coherence test of truth. The fact that it doesn't comport with reality, it contradicts reality, that causes it to fail the correspondence theory of truth. Its horrific consequences, such as eugenics, mass murder, and justified abortion, makes it fail the pragmatic theory of truth. And logically, you could dismiss this rather easily, as I've been doing for the last 4 hours. So it fails the semantic theory of truth. In other words, all 4 theories of truth actually destroy the theory of evolution. This really is a fairy tale for grown-ups. It is. I don't know why any rational person believes this. Well, I do. Here's why people believe this. Evolution is what the post-Enlightenment secular man needs to try to understand and interact with this world apart from God. They need something to where they could say, I could interact with this world and I don't need God. And evolution replaces God for me. That's really what it is. People believe in the theory of evolution not for a scientific reason, but for a psychological reason. It gives them pretty much the excuse they need, the alternative. And if we go back to that third lesson, that philosophy of unbelievers, remember how I said unbelievers toggle back and forth between atheism and idolatry? Evolution is both at the same time. It's idolatry because they need it as their crutch in their mind to say, I could get by without God, right? So it's an idol, but at the same time, it's atheism as well, because ultimately they're trying to say with this that there's no God. So again, they're just running from God's special revelation. They're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, and this is their alternative creation myth. That's what it is. That's all it is. But when we break it down, we strip it down to its bare parts, it is just another metaphysical theory about origins. And so we would do well to remind them of it, that this is metaphysics far more than it is physics or biology. So we need to bring the theory back to the presuppositional level so that we can help them cast it straight into the abyss from which it came. So the reason why I spent so much time on this is the general theory of evolution is the biggest single objection in Western societies. And it has been the vehicle that politically has been used to push Christianity out of the public square, out of the schools, out of the government, and really just into your house and into your church. It's been presented as, this is the fact, it's neutral, which it's not. And this is what I'm telling you. When you send your kids to college, okay, I think that the stat was something like close to 90% of kids raised in churches in their first 2 years of college deny the faith, and they almost always say it's because they're convinced by the theory of evolution within their first 2 years at college. And it's because they're not being taught this stuff. They're not being prepared in the churches and stuff like that. This is one of the biggest threats. Okay, at the high school level, the biggest threat to your kids right now is the LGBT revolution, because it uses peer pressure to play on people's emotions and all that. If they survive that and think, no, that all doesn't make sense because, people are identifying as a dog and saying their pronouns are Fido and stuff like that, that doesn't make any sense. But then they get to college and somebody gives the evidence for evolution, and mom and dad never told me anything other than don't believe in evolution, it's from the devil, then what's going to happen is they're going to be drawn away. So I spent as much time as I did on this is because this one's the biggest threat for us in our culture. It really is. And the last thing I'll say is this. I spent 4 hours tearing it down. Anybody could do that. But the apologetic task also requires us to build up. We tear down what's false, we build up what's true. It's easy to show what's wrong. It doesn't take a lot of skill to do that. But where the real strength of our apologetic is going to come is when we could say, now that we've demolished your worldview, step into mine. Let me show you how with the Bible it all works. And that's what I'm going to be doing for probably the next 4 weeks as well. I'm going to have just as much building ours up as I did tearing theirs down. I'm using evolution as the special case to go much deeper than I am with the other worldviews, so you could see just how beautiful this apologetic method is, just how good the argument from Folly is. 4 hours worth of information, right, to tear it down. And then you're going to see just how really, like Al already brought up one of it, the fact that there's 3 mitochondrial DNA lines. Of all women on earth. Just think about that for a second. Why would that be the case? How many women were on the ark, Noah's ark? 3. Well, there were 4, but Noah's wife wasn't having any more kids. So how many childbearing women were on that ark? 3. And there happens to be 3 mitochondrial lines. Yet there's only 1 Y chromosome line because those 3 boys all came from Noah. So you look at men all over the world, we share the same Y chromosome. Women can share 1 of 3. That's one example. Step into our worldview. Let us show you what the Bible says happened, and now let's compare it with the data out there. So we're going to have some fun when we get to that. It'll be more positive, and you'll see just how powerful the Christian worldview is. With that, we will close and